They set up cameras. They were laughing. Over 1,000 militants gathered in the open, armed, confident, filming a propaganda video to mock the man they thought was already finished. They had no idea what was hovering above them. No idea that every single movement, every laugh, every frame of that footage was being watched. And then, in one surgical moment, everything changed. The explosions came before the screams. And the most shocking part? The camera kept recording. This is not a war story. This is the moment the hunters became the hunted. And France still cannot explain how they missed it. They had cameras rolling when the drones arrived. More than 1,000 militants had gathered in the open terrain of northern Burkina Faso, not in secret, not in scattered groups, but in a mass formation so bold it bordered on theatrical. They had set up cameras. They were filming propaganda. They were celebrating a victory that had not yet happened, mocking a government they believed was crumbling, taunting a military leader they had underestimated. And somewhere high above them, invisible against the Sahelian sky, armed drones were watching every second of it. On February 19, 2026, those drones fired. What followed was not just a military engagement. It was a message, precise, brutal, and unmistakable, sent not only to the militants on the ground, but to every observer watching the Sahel, to neighboring governments, to France, to Washington, to Moscow, and to every armed group that had concluded that Burkina Faso under Captain Ibrahim Traoré was a soft target sliding toward collapse. The strike killed a reported mass of fighters linked to an al-Qaeda-affiliated insurgent network. It destroyed their assembly point. It scattered those who survived. And in one of the most extraordinary ironies of modern African counterinsurgency, the military seized the militants' own cameras and broadcast their footage, reframed, repurposed, and weaponized, as evidence of their defeat. This is the story of what happened in northern Burkina Faso in early 2026. But to understand it, you need to understand the country that made it possible, and the man at its center. Burkina Faso has been bleeding for nearly a decade. The landlocked West African nation, squeezed between Mali to the north and west, Niger to the east, and Ghana, Togo, Benin, and Côte d'Ivoire to the south, has been at the epicenter of what analysts call the most dangerous jihadist insurgency in the world today. The violence traces its origin to northern Mali, where armed groups exploiting the chaos of the 2012 Tuareg rebellion and the subsequent collapse of Muammar Gaddafi's regime in Libya began expanding southward with ruthless efficiency. By the mid-2010s, the insurgency had crossed into Burkina Faso's northern and eastern regions, and by the early 2020s, the country had become the global epicenter of terrorism-related fatalities, surpassing even Afghanistan and Syria in some years by certain metrics. The groups driving this violence are not monolithic. The two most powerful are Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin, commonly known as JNIM, which operates under the broader al-Qaeda umbrella, and the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, or ISGS, which pledges loyalty to ISIS. These groups are not simply criminal gangs. They are organized, ideologically motivated, tactically sophisticated, and increasingly capable of holding territory. By 2023, estimates suggested that jihadist forces controlled or contested up to 40% of Burkina Faso's national territory. Entire provinces in the north and east were effectively cut off from the central government in Ouagadougou. Humanitarian corridors collapsed. Supply routes to major towns like Djibo were besieged. Civilians were caught between armed groups demanding compliance and a military struggling to respond. It was into this crisis that Ibrahim Traoré stepped, or more precisely, seized his moment. In September 2022, Traoré, then a 34-year-old army captain, led a second coup in less than a year, ousting Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Damiba, who had himself taken power in January 2022. Traoré accused Damiba of failing to reverse the security collapse. He promised a new approach. He was the youngest head of state in the world at the time of his seizure of power, and from the beginning, he positioned himself not merely as a military administrator managing a crisis, but as a revolutionary, a leader in the mold of Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's iconic Marxist president who was assassinated in 1987 and who remains one of the most admired political figures in Pan-African memory. Traoré's political identity is inseparable from his rejection of France. This is not simply rhetoric. It reflects a genuine and deepening current in Sahelian public opinion, particularly among younger generations who grew up watching French military intervention, most notably Operation Barkhane, which deployed thousands of French troops across the Sahel for nearly a decade, failed to stop, and in some analyses actively correlate with the expansion of jihadist violence. Whether that framing is entirely fair is a matter of serious debate. But the political reality is that anti-French sentiment became one of the most powerful mobilizing forces in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger after 2021. Traoré acted on it. Within months of taking power, he expelled the French ambassador. He terminated defense agreements that had governed French military presence on Burkinabè soil. He ordered the closure of Radio France Internationale's operations in the country. And like Mali before him, he turned to Russia, specifically to the Wagner Group, the private military company that had already deployed to Mali and the Central African Republic, and which was operating under various rebranding efforts after the death of its founder Yevgeny Prigozhin, as an instrument of Russian strategic projection in Africa. This pivot was controversial, analytically complicated, and not without its own contradictions. Wagner's record in Mali and CAR includes credible, well-documented allegations of massacres against civilian populations. Human rights organizations have linked the group to atrocities in multiple countries. Critics of Traoré argued that replacing one external patron with another, swapping France for Russia, was not liberation but a different form of dependency, and a potentially more dangerous one given Wagner's operational conduct. Traoré and his supporters rejected this framing, arguing that sovereignty required the ability to choose one's partners, and that the results on the ground would speak for themselves. By late 2025 and into early 2026, something was beginning to shift in the security picture, though the full picture remains contested. To understand the February 19 strike, you need to understand what was actually happening on the ground in northern Burkina Faso in the weeks leading up to it. The militants were not hiding. That is the detail that stands out most starkly in retrospect. JNIM-affiliated fighters, numbering, according to Burkinabè military and independent assessments, in excess of 1,000 individuals, had assembled in a single location in the north. This was unusual. Insurgent groups in the Sahel typically operate in dispersed, decentralized formations precisely because concentration creates vulnerability. The fact that such a large force gathered in one place, openly enough to set up camera equipment and film propaganda content, suggests either extraordinary overconfidence, a failure of operational security discipline, or a deliberate demonstration of strength intended to send a message to Ouagadougou. The propaganda being filmed was specifically mocking Ibrahim Traoré. This is significant context. Traoré had become, over the preceding year, not just a political figure, but a symbol, one that carried enormous emotional weight for a population exhausted by violence and humiliation. His rhetorical defiance of France, his invocations of Sankara's legacy, his public appearances dressed in the red beret and military fatigues associated with Pan-African radicalism, had made him a figure who attracted both genuine popular enthusiasm and intense opposition. To mock him was, in the insurgents' framing, to mock the entire premise of his government's legitimacy. What the militants filming those propaganda videos did not know, or chose to disregard, was that Burkina Faso's military had been tracking their movements. Armed drones had been monitoring the assembly. When the force was concentrated, when the cameras were rolling and the fighters were at their most exposed, the strike came. Precision munitions struck the gathering with devastating effect. The initial strike was followed by secondary strikes targeting fighters attempting to scatter and flee. The operational logic here is notable. This was not a single pass intended to disrupt. It was a sustained engagement designed to maximize the destruction of a concentrated enemy force. The militants' cameras and equipment were subsequently captured by the Burkinabè army. And then came the detail that will likely be studied in military communications classrooms for years. The military broadcast the insurgents' own footage. The video that was meant to celebrate the militants' anticipated triumph was repackaged and aired as documentation of their annihilation. The psychological warfare dimension of this cannot be overstated. Insurgent groups in the Sahel have, for years, successfully weaponized information. Beheading videos, execution recordings, footage of military retreats. All of it has been deployed to demoralize government forces, frighten civilian populations, and recruit new fighters. The message was always the same. The state is weak. We are inevitable. Resistance is futile. By seizing and rebroadcasting the militants' own propaganda materials as evidence of their defeat, Traoré's military inverted that logic completely. The camera that was meant to capture their glory became the instrument of their humiliation. Is this a genuine turning point in Burkina Faso's war, or a single spectacular engagement whose strategic significance will fade? That question deserves serious, unromantic analysis. Let's start with what the strike does represent. The use of armed drones in the Sahel counterinsurgency context marks a meaningful shift in the technological character of the conflict. For most of the past decade, the asymmetry of this war favored the insurgents. They moved on motorcycles, disappeared into terrain, blended with civilian populations, and struck when and where they chose. Government forces, trained and equipped largely for conventional warfare, struggled to adapt. The introduction of persistent aerial surveillance, the ability to watch, track, and strike from above without exposing ground forces to ambush, fundamentally changes that calculus. Where did these drones come from? This is a question with significant geopolitical implications and, at the moment of writing, not entirely resolved public answers. Russia, through its various state and quasi-state defense channels, has been supplying drone technology to Sahelian governments allied with Moscow. Turkey's Bayraktar TB2, which achieved global fame through its use in Ukraine and Libya, has also circulated in African security contexts. Iran has been a supplier of armed drone technology in several conflict theaters. The specific origin of the drones used in the February 19 strike has not been definitively confirmed in open-source reporting, but the operational capability they represent is unambiguous. The strike also demonstrated something important about intelligence and surveillance: that Burkina Faso's military, with whatever external assistance it is receiving, had achieved the capacity to track a force of more than 1,000 fighters over a sufficient period to plan and execute a coordinated precision engagement. This is not a small thing. Intelligence capacity in the Sahel has historically been one of the critical limiting factors in counterinsurgency effectiveness. Local knowledge, source networks, signals intelligence, aerial surveillance. The integration of all of these into actionable targeting is a genuine military achievement, regardless of who assisted in it. At the same time, honest analysis requires acknowledging what the strike does not mean. One successful engagement, however spectacular, does not resolve a decade-long insurgency. JNIM remains a large, adaptive, ideologically coherent organization with deep roots in northern Mali and expanding presence across the tri-border area between Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The organization has demonstrated repeatedly that it can absorb tactical defeats, reconstitute its forces, adjust its tactics, and continue operating. The loss of more than 1,000 fighters in a single strike is significant. It is not existential. Burkina Faso's underlying structural vulnerabilities have not been addressed by a drone strike. The country's north and east remain undergoverned. Civilian populations in those regions have been subjected to years of violence, displacement, and state absence. The humanitarian situation, particularly in siege-affected towns, remains severe. A military that wins on the battlefield must eventually be matched by a governance presence capable of holding the territory, delivering services, and offering an alternative to the insurgent political economy. None of that happens automatically because of a drone strike. There is also the uncomfortable reality of civilian casualty risk in any counterinsurgency air campaign. The February 19th engagement appears, based on available information, to have targeted a military assembly of fighters rather than a civilian area. But as drone campaigns escalate, the risk of misidentification, of intelligence failures, of strikes that kill civilians alongside combatants, or instead of them, becomes a serious concern. Counterinsurgency history is littered with examples of military successes that produced political setbacks because of civilian harm. The Burkinabè government will need to manage this dynamic carefully as it pursues this strategy. France's reported shock at the scale and precision of the strike is one of the most geopolitically revealing elements of this entire episode, and it demands unpacking. Paris has maintained deep structural involvement in the security architectures of its former West African colonies for decades through the framework known as Francafrique. This network of political, economic, military, and intelligence relationships has given France extraordinary influence over the domestic affairs of countries nominally independent since the early 1960s. French troops have intervened militarily in African conflicts dozens of times since decolonization. French intelligence services have maintained relationships with governments, opposition figures, military officers, and business elites across the continent. The CFA franc, the common currency used by many West African nations and pegged to the euro under French guarantees, has been one of the most durable instruments of French economic influence in the region. When Traore expelled French forces and pivoted toward Russia, the French government was not merely losing a security partner. It was losing a node in a web of influence that had, in various forms, persisted since the colonial era. The fact that French officials were reportedly caught off guard by the scale of the February 19 strike suggests something important. France's intelligence picture of Burkina Faso has degraded significantly since the rupture of security cooperation. When you lose your military presence, your embedded advisors, your joint intelligence structures, you lose your visibility. France may now know significantly less about what is happening inside Burkina Faso than it did 2 years ago. This is a remarkable reversal. For decades, it was African governments that complained about French surveillance and interference. Now, it appears to be the French who are finding themselves operating in an intelligence blind spot, at least with respect to a country they once considered firmly within their sphere of influence. The reaction in Ouagadougou and among Traoré's supporters was, predictably, triumphal. The narrative writes itself, a young African revolutionary, rejected by the former colonial power, building sovereign military capacity with new partners, defeating the enemies that the French-backed system failed to suppress for a decade. Whether or not that narrative is entirely accurate in its causation, whether Russia's contribution was decisive, whether the French really could have achieved the same outcome if they had remained, is less important politically than the fact that the narrative exists and resonates powerfully. The regional implications of this strike extend well beyond Burkina Faso's borders. The alliance of Sahel states, the political and security bloc formed by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger following their respective coups and expulsions of French forces, has positioned itself as a new model for African sovereignty. The three countries have withdrawn from ECOWAS, the regional bloc dominated by more pro-Western governments. They have established their own mutual defense pact. They have collectively signaled an intent to chart a path outside traditional Western security and economic frameworks. The February 19 strike will be read within this context as a validation of the bloc's security posture. If Burkina Faso can achieve a military victory of this scale using drones and intelligence assets assembled outside the French-led framework, that significantly strengthens the political case that the alliance of Sahel states model is viable, that you can in fact tell the former colonial power to leave and still defend your territory. This matters enormously for other governments in the region who are watching closely. Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, Guinea, and others have their own political tensions around French influence, their own population skeptical of the post-colonial security framework. None of them have taken the step Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have taken. But every development that suggests the anti-French, Russia-aligned model is producing results on the battlefield in terms of political stability, in terms of economic management, increases the pressure on pro-Western governments in the region to reckon with their own population's frustrations. Russia, for its part, has a profound interest in amplifying the story of this strike. The narrative that Russian-supplied capability enabled an African government to defeat a large al-Qaeda-affiliated force, while France stood by shocked and excluded, is precisely the kind of story that Moscow's Africa strategy is built around. Expect this narrative to receive extensive amplification through Russian state media, through Wagner-aligned social media networks, and through the information ecosystems that Russian operators have built across Francophone Africa over the past several years. The United States is watching this with its own set of concerns. American counterterrorism strategy in the Sahel has, for years, operated in partnership with French forces and with regional governments that maintain security cooperation with Washington. The loss of access in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, including the expulsion of American troops from Niger, which hosts a strategically important drone base, represents a significant contraction of American counterterrorism reach in one of the world's most active jihadist theaters. The February 19 strike does not make that situation better from Washington's perspective. If Burkina Faso is demonstrating that it can conduct effective counterterrorism operations without American or French assistance, the leverage those partners had, however limited it may have been in recent years, is further reduced. What happens next could reshape the security architecture of the entire Western Sahel. If the February 19 strike represents the beginning of a sustained offensive campaign rather than a one-off success, the implications for JNIM are serious. The group's strategic posture has, in recent years, rested partly on the assumption that it can assemble forces, control territory, and project power without facing decisive aerial interdiction. If Burkina Faso, and potentially its alliance partners in Mali and Niger, can sustain this kind of drone-enabled surveillance and strike capability, the cost calculus for large-scale militant assembly changes fundamentally. JNIM will adapt. This is not speculation, it is pattern. Insurgent groups that face aerial threat disperse. They change their communication methods. They reduce their signature. They push operations into areas where aerial surveillance is harder to maintain. Dense vegetation, urban environments, areas with greater civilian population density, where strikes risk collateral damage. Adaptation takes time and imposes costs, but adaptive capacity is one of NIM's demonstrated strengths. There's also the question of the insurgency's relationship with civilian populations. JNIM has, in many communities in northern Burkina Faso and Mali, cultivated a degree of local support or at minimum acquiescence through a combination of coercion and governance provision. In areas where the state has been absent, the group has provided dispute resolution, taxed economic activity, and imposed its version of social order. Military strikes, however precise, do not by themselves displace that relationship. The government in Ouagadougou will need to move quickly and credibly to extend state presence and service delivery into areas where militant control has been reduced. And here is where the Traore government faces its most difficult long-term challenge. The captain has proven, with February 19th, that his military can strike hard. What he has not yet demonstrated is that his government can govern, that the revolutionary rhetoric about sovereignty and transformation can be matched by the administrative reality of a functioning state reaching its most remote and traumatized citizens. Burkina Faso is a poor country. Its fiscal resources are limited. Its administrative capacity, already stretched before the insurgency began, has been further degraded by years of conflict-driven displacement and institutional disruption. The Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, known by their French acronym VDP, are a critical part of Traoré's security architecture. These are civilian militias recruited to support the military against insurgent groups, and they number in the tens of thousands. Their role has been politically important, symbolizing a kind of national mobilization for defense. But their operational record has been complicated by credible reports of extrajudicial violence and human rights abuses against civilians accused of collaborating with militants. If the VDP's conduct alienates the very communities it is supposed to protect, it risks driving civilians toward the insurgency rather than away from it, a dynamic that has derailed counterinsurgency campaigns in many other contexts. The information warfare dimension of this episode deserves its own moment of analysis, because it points to something genuinely new in the counterinsurgency landscape. For years, jihadist groups in the Sahel have outcompete governments in the information space. They have produced slick propaganda videos, disseminated through encrypted channels and social media platforms, that reached audiences not just in West Africa, but globally, in diaspora communities, in recruitment networks, in the broader ecosystem of jihadist ideological consumption. Governments, including Burkina Faso's, have struggled to match this output, partly because of capacity limitations and partly because the nature of state communication, formal, bureaucratic, often slow, does not lend itself to the kind of emotionally resonant content that insurgent groups produce with relative ease. What happened after February 19th broke that pattern in a specific and significant way. By broadcasting the militants' own footage, repurposed as evidence of their defeat, the Burkinabè military didn't just win a news cycle. It demonstrated an understanding of the information environment that suggests a more sophisticated communication strategy. The irony embedded in the move is powerful. You filmed your own destruction. Every viewer who sees that footage in Burkina Faso, in the Sahel, in the global African diaspora, receives the same message. The invincibility is a performance. And this government is not playing along. This is particularly significant because it addresses one of the insurgency's most potent psychological weapons, the sense of inevitability. When JNIM films its operations and distributes the footage, it is not just creating a historical record. It is building a narrative that recruitment, territory, and momentum are all flowing in one direction. That narrative has been more powerful, in many ways, than any single military engagement. By attacking it directly, by taking the militants' own production and turning it into evidence of failure. Traore's government has struck at the psychological infrastructure of the insurgency in a way that conventional military action cannot easily reach. Whether this represents a sustained information strategy or a one-time opportunistic move remains to be seen. But the instinct behind it is analytically sound, and it will be closely watched by other governments in the region facing similar information warfare challenges.